You brought her to my bed. By sunrise, you will own nothing. Sign the papers.
Darling, wait, please. It was a mistake.
Your mistake cost you everything.
The heavy oak doors of the master bedchamber swung open, revealing not her new husband's embrace, but the cruelest of betrayals. He stood holding a golden-haired woman, laughing. "Take the dressing room, my dear," he sneered. She didn't weep. By dawn, she would make him choke on those very words. The year was 1814, and the unforgiving high society of London was entirely consumed by the wedding of the decade. The air inside street, George's. Hanover Square was thick with the scent of white roses, burning wax, and the quiet, envious whispers of the English aristocracy. Lady Arabella Montgomery, sole heiress to the vast Montgomery mercantile empire, was marrying Tristan Somerset, the 9th Duke of Rothbury. To the untrained eye, it was a fairy tale ripped from the pages of a romantic novel. Tristan was devastatingly handsome, with raven hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He bore a title that traced its origins back to the Norman conquest. Arabella, on the other hand, was striking but practical, a woman who possessed a mind sharper than cut glass, honed by years of watching her late father build an empire of trading ships that dominated the ports of the East Indies. But this union was no love match. It was a brutal, cold-blooded transaction. The Duke of Rothbury possessed immense social power, but was drowning in generational ruin. Arabella possessed a fortune so staggering that even the crown whispered about it. But she required a peerage to secure her social standing and protect her assets from greedy, lesser suitors, or so Tristan believed. The reception at the Duke's sprawling Grosvenor Square townhouse was an exercise in pure opulence. Champagne flowed like the Thames, and the orchestra played waltzes that vibrated through the crystal chandeliers. Throughout the evening, Tristan played the part of the doting groom to absolute perfection. He kissed Arabella's gloved hand, he murmured sweet nothings for the benefit of the surrounding gossips, and he smiled with a warmth that almost, just almost, made Arabella believe that they could forge a formidable partnership. She did not ask for love, but she expected respect. As the grand clock in the foyer struck midnight, the time came for the newlyweds to retire. The guests cheered, raising their glasses as Arabella was led up the grand marble staircase to the ducal suite. Her heart beat a steady, pragmatic rhythm against her ribs. She was prepared for her duty. She was prepared to be a duchess. But when the heavy oak doors of the master bedchamber clicked shut behind her, the intoxicating illusion of the evening shattered into jagged, bleeding pieces. Arabella stepped into the cavernous room, lit by a roaring fire and dozens of candelabras. Standing at the foot of the massive four-poster bed was her husband, but he was not alone. Wrapped in a scandalous robe of crimson silk, sipping from a crystal glass of Arabella's own imported brandy, was Penelope Vane. Penelope was a notorious stage actress, a woman possessing golden curls, and a reputation that made the society matrons clutch their pearls. Arabella stopped dead in her tracks. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Tristan did not look ashamed. He did not look panicked. Instead, a slow, cruel smirk spread across his aristocratic face. He casually loosened his immaculate white cravat and wrapped a proprietary arm around Penelope's waist. The mistress giggled, casting a look of pure, unadulterated pity and mockery at the new duchess. "Tristan," Arabella said, her voice eerily calm, though the blood roared in her ears. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, my dear Arabella, is that our business transaction concluded at the altar," Tristan drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. "You have your precious coronet. You are the Duchess of Rothbury. The society papers will fawn over you, but my private life remains entirely my own. Penelope has been my companion for 3 years, and she shall remain so." He gestured vaguely toward a small, shadowed door in the corner of the suite. "There is a cot in the dressing room. You may sleep there tonight. And in the morning, my steward will show you to the Dowager's wing in the East Corridor. We will make our public appearances as required, but do not mistake our financial arrangement for a right to my bed or my affection." Penelope laughed, a high, grating sound. "Don't fret, Your Grace," the mistress purred, weaponizing the title. "He really is terribly demanding. You should be thanking me for taking the burden off your hands." A lesser woman would have collapsed. A lesser woman would have wept, screamed, hurled a vase, or run fleeing from the room in a storm of humiliated tears. For a fleeting second, Tristan braced himself for the hysterics. But Arabella Montgomery was her father's daughter. She was raised among cutthroat merchants, harbor masters, and ruthless negotiators. She did not cry. Her face settled into a mask of pure, terrifying porcelain. She looked at Penelope, taking in the cheap silk and the desperate ambition in the woman's eyes. Then she looked at Tristan, seeing him for the first time, not as a duke, but as a foolish, arrogant boy who had fundamentally misunderstood the game he was playing. "The dressing room," Arabella repeated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Yes," Tristan commanded, turning his back on her to pour another drink for his mistress. "And do close the door tightly. Penelope is a light sleeper." "As you wish, Your Grace," Arabella murmured. She did not go to the dressing room. She turned on her heel, her heavy silk wedding gown whispering against the Persian rug, and walked quietly back out the main oak doors, closing them softly behind her. The moment the latch clicked into place, the Duchess of Rothbury ceased to be a bride. She became an architect of ruin. The hallways of the Grosvenor Square mansion were dark and silent, the servants having retired to the lower levels to celebrate the wedding with the leftover ale. Arabella moved like a phantom through the shadows. She did not seek comfort. She sought the Duke's private study. The study was locked, but Arabella, anticipating the need to manage the estate's affairs, had already secured a master ring of keys from the housekeeper the day before. She slipped the brass key into the lock, turned it, and slipped inside, lighting a single oil lamp. The room smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and desperation. Tristan believed he held all the cards. He believed that, under English law, a husband gained absolute control over his wife's fortune upon marriage. He thought the Montgomery millions were now his to squander on his mistresses, his gambling debts, and his decaying country estates. But Tristan had vastly underestimated the brilliance of Arabella's late father and the ruthless cunning of the Montgomery family solicitor, Mr. Nathaniel Gresham. Arabella moved swiftly to the Duke's massive mahogany desk. She began pulling open drawers, searching for the leather-bound ledgers that contained the true state of the Rothbury finances. She found them in the bottom drawer, locked in a metal box that she easily pried open with a heavy brass letter opener. She spread the ledgers across the desk, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers in the dim light. It was worse than she had imagined. Tristan was not just in debt. He was drowning in a financial abyss. He owed exorbitant sums to Drummond's Bank. He had outstanding promissory notes to half the gentlemen at White's Club. His country estate, Rothbury Hall, was mortgaged to the hilt, and he owed thousands of pounds to a syndicate of ruthless private lenders in the City of London. Tristan's entire survival depended entirely on the massive dowry Arabella brought to the marriage, a sum of £300,000. Arabella pulled a separate, velvet-wrapped document from the bodice of her gown. It was a copy of her marriage settlements, drafted by Nathaniel Gresham, and finalized at the prestigious Coutts & Co. banking house. Before her father died, he had warned her, "Aristocrats are like peacocks, Arabella. Beautiful to look at, but they possess tiny brains and voracious appetites. Never hand them the keys to the granary." The marriage settlement was an ironclad trust. Yes, the law dictated a husband controlled his wife's money, but a well-constructed court of chancery trust could bypass this. The Montgomery fortune was not handed to Tristan outright. The dowry was locked in a trust managed by Mr. Gresham. Arabella traced her finger down the heavy parchment to the clauses that Tristan, in his arrogant haste to sign the papers and secure his salvation, had clearly not read thoroughly. Clause 7, subsection C. The funds would only be released to the Duke of Rothbury to settle his debts upon the legal countersignature of the Duchess, confirming her secure and honorable establishment in the primary ducal residence and the lawful consummation of the union. Clause 9. Should the Duke abandon, publicly humiliate, or refuse to honor the Duchess's position, effectively breaching the marital contract before its physical completion, the trust explicitly retained the right to purchase the Duke's debts from his creditors, thereby making the Montgomery Trust his sole and primary creditor, with the immediate right to foreclose on all unentailed properties. A cold, beautiful smile touched Arabella's lips. Tristan had brought a mistress to their wedding bed. He had explicitly denied the consummation of the marriage. He had banished her to a dressing room. He had literally handed her the legal mechanism to destroy him. She checked the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 1:30 in the morning. She had 4.5 hours until dawn. Arabella did not hesitate. She moved to the bell pull and yanked it sharply. A few moments later, a soft knock sounded, and Martha Tinsdale, Arabella's fiercely loyal lady's maid who had been with her since childhood, slipped into the room. Martha took one look at Arabella's face, pale, fierce, and entirely unbothered by bridal bliss, and immediately stood at attention. "My lady?" Martha asked, in a hushed whisper. "Martha, the Duke has decided to occupy his bedchamber with a woman named Penelope Vane," Arabella said, her voice brisk and businesslike. Martha gasped, her face flushing with outrage. "That absolute swine! I shall fetch the footman! We will throw her out into the street!" "No," Arabella cut her off sharply. "We will do no such thing. Let them sleep. Let them enjoy their stolen brandy and their foolish arrogance. I need you to perform a task of absolute secrecy. You are to leave this house through the kitchen entrance. Go to Mr. Nathaniel Gresham's residence in Mayfair. Wake him. Tell him the sunset protocol has been breached, and we are activating the sunrise clause. He must immediately send messengers to Drummond's Bank and the private lenders. I want every single promissory note bearing the Duke of Rothbury's signature purchased by the Montgomery Trust before the sun breaches the horizon." Martha's eyes widened as she understood the magnitude of the order. "Every single one, Your Grace? Every last penny, Martha. By morning, I want Tristan Somerset to owe his soul to me. Now, go." As Martha vanished into the night, Arabella sat at the Duke's desk. She uncorked his inkwell, pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, and began to write. She drafted the legal testimonies, detailing the events of the bedchamber, noting the exact time, and officially refusing to sign the release of the dowry funds based on non-consummation and egregious moral breach. For hours, the only sounds in the study were the scratching of Arabella's quill and the ticking of the clock. She was not a weeping bride. She was a general mapping out a battlefield, and the enemy was currently sleeping deeply, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been seized. The first pale streaks of dawn crept over the rooftops of London, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Inside the Grosvenor Square mansion, the heavy silence of the night was broken by the sharp, authoritative sound of heavy boots marching across the marble foyer. Arabella stood at the top of the grand staircase, still wearing her elaborate wedding gown, though she had stripped off the heavy lace veil and tossed it aside. She looked down to see Mr. Nathaniel Gresham, his usually immaculate cravat, tied hastily, carrying a massive leather briefcase. Behind him stood 3 stern-faced clerks and, crucially, 2 burly men who looked less like legal professionals and more like enforcers from the London docks. Gresham looked up at his most prized client. "It is done, Your Grace," he said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "My clerks woke the directors of Drummond's Bank in their beds. We roused the moneylenders in the city. Given the Duke's perilous standing, they were only too eager to sell off his debts for guaranteed Montgomery gold. As of 5:45 this morning, the Montgomery Trust owns every mortgage, every gambling marker, and every outstanding debt tied to Tristan Somerset. The total is staggering, nearly £200,000. Arabella descended the stairs, her expression unreadable. "And the dowry release?" Gresham pulled a parchment from his case. "Legally frozen. Lord Chancellor Eldon himself established the precedent last year regarding moral breach prior to consummation. By denying you the bedchamber and installing a mistress, the Duke has voided his immediate right to the funds. He is entirely exposed. You hold the deeds to this very house, his country estate, and all movable assets not explicitly tied to the ancient entailment. You are his absolute master. Arabella took the stack of deeds and promissory notes, the thick parchment heavy in her hands. The sheer weight of Tristan's foolishness was bound in red ribbon. Excellent, Nathaniel. Wait here. Arabella walked back up the stairs, signaling for the two burly enforcers to follow her. She marched down the eastern corridor, past the sleeping portraits of Tristan's ancestors, until she reached the heavy oak doors of the master suite. She didn't knock, she gestured to the enforcers. The men grabbed the heavy brass handles and threw the doors open with a violently loud crash that shook the walls. Inside the bedchamber, Tristan and Penelope jolted awake with shrieks of panic. The mistress scrambled to pull the velvet sheets over her bare chest, while Tristan, bleary-eyed and furious, leapt from the mattress, grabbing a discarded silk robe. "What is the meaning of this?" Tristan roared, his face purple with aristocratic rage. "How dare you burst in here? I am the Duke of Rothbury. I told you to stay in the dressing room, you insolent." Silence. Arabella's voice cracked through the room like a bullwhip. The absolute authority in her tone actually made Tristan snap his mouth shut. He blinked, finally registering that his bride was not crying, not cowering, and certainly not alone. She was flanked by two massive men who looked entirely unimpressed by his title. Arabella walked slowly to the foot of the bed, her eyes sweeping over the disheveled, pathetic scene. Penelope Vane shrank back against the headboard, suddenly realizing that the power dynamic in the room was not what she had been promised. "I have spent the night reviewing your ledgers, Tristan," Arabella said smoothly, tossing the heavy stack of promissory notes onto the foot of the bed. They landed with a heavy, damning thud. Tristan stared at the documents, his brain slowly catching up to the situation. He recognized the wax seals of Drummond's bank. He recognized the red ribbons of his private lenders. A cold, suffocating panic began to claw at his throat. What are those?" he stammered, the arrogant drawl vanishing entirely. "These," Arabella said softly, "are your chains. You thought you married a docile bank vault, Tristan. You thought you could take my money, humiliate me, and parade your harlot in my bed. But you failed to read the fine print." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Because you abandoned me on our wedding night, our marriage remains legally unconsummated. Because you brought her times into our bed, you breached the morality clause of the Montgomery Trust. My dowry is frozen. You will not see a single penny of it." Tristan's face drained of all color. He looked like a corpse. No, that's impossible. The law states that a trust operates independently of standard marital asset transfers, Arabella interrupted sharply. "Furthermore, my solicitor has spent the last 5 hours traversing London. The Montgomery Trust has purchased every single one of your debts. Every loan, every mortgage, every gambling marker. I own it all." Penelope gasped, looking from Arabella to Tristan. "Tristan, what is she saying?" the mistress demanded shrilly. Arabella didn't even look at the other woman. She kept her piercing gaze locked on her husband. "It means, Penelope, that the Duke is bankrupt. It means that as of sunrise this morning, I own the deed to this house. I own the mortgage to Rothbury Hall. I own the very bed you are currently sweating in. And as the primary debt holder, I am officially calling in the loans. Immediately." Tristan stumbled backward, his knees hitting the mattress. Arabella, please, be reasonable. We can." "Get out." Arabella's command was absolute. "What?" Tristan whispered. "Get out of my house," Arabella said, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, triumphant fire. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever clothes you can carry. The rest of the assets in this house, including the art, the silver, and the carriages, belong to the bank, which is me. If you or your mistress are still in this building when the grandfather clock chimes 6, These gentlemen will throw you both into the street without your small clothes." Tristan Somerset, the 9th Duke of Rothbury, looked at the woman he had tried to break. He realized, with crushing, agonizing clarity, that he hadn't married a victim. He had married an executioner. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Grosvenor Square mansion ticked with the deafening rhythm of a judge's gavel. Tristan Somerset stood on the magnificent Persian carpet, shivering in the dawn chill, dressed only in a hastily tied cravat, a rumpled waistcoat, and trousers he had dragged on with trembling hands. Beside him stood Penelope Vane. The actress had abandoned all pretenses of dramatic devotion the moment the burly enforcers had stepped into the room. With terrifying efficiency, she had shoved her expensive cosmetics, the diamond necklace Tristan had purchased on credit the week prior, and several of the Duke's silver hairbrushes into a velvet traveling sack. "Penelope, darling, you must wait," Tristan pleaded, his voice a pathetic croak. "This is merely a misunderstanding, a temporary legal block. I am a peer of the realm. She cannot simply throw me into the street. I will go to my solicitors. We will have this overturned by noon." Penelope paused at the heavy oak doors leading out to the street. She turned, her golden curls catching the morning light, but her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. She looked at Tristan not with love, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a merchant examining spoiled goods. "Tristan, sweetings," Penelope said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "You are not a peer of the realm this morning. You are a pauper with a fancy name. That terrifying wife of yours owns the very boots on your feet. I am an actress, my love. I do tragedies on the stage, not in my private life." Before Tristan could utter another word, Penelope swept out the door, hailing a passing hackney cab and vanishing into the London mist. She did not look back. "Time is up, Your Grace," one of Arabella's enforcers rumbled, stepping forward. "Out. You. Go." Tristan was physically ushered out the front door, stumbling down the grand marble steps and landing unceremoniously on the cobblestones. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet, aristocratic square. He was the Duke of Rothbury, and he was entirely, utterly homeless. Over the next 48 hours, the scandal consumed high society with the ferocity of a wildfire. The aristocracy thrived on gossip, but this was a spectacle unlike anything they had ever witnessed. The Morning Post Times published a thinly veiled column about a certain Duke of R who had been locked out of his own bedchamber by his mercantile bride on their wedding night. Tristan, desperate and seeking refuge, attempted to enter White's Club in St. James's Street. He strutted up to the iconic bow window, expecting the usual deferential nods from his peers. Instead, the club secretary, a severe man named Mr. Harrington. No, wait, let us use Mr. Brummel's associate, Mr. Alvanley, as Lord Alvanley was a real historical figure known for his wit, intercepted him in the foyer. "Apologies, Rothbury," Lord Alvanley said, adjusting his monocle with a look of supreme disdain. "But word from the city is that your gambling markers are now held by a private trust. The committee has decided that until your domestic and financial embarrassments are resolved, your membership is suspended. Good day." Humiliated, Tristan was forced to take lodgings in a dingy, damp inn near Covent Garden, a far cry from the silk sheets and imported brandy he was accustomed to. He met with a solicitor, a notoriously slimy barrister named Mr. Barnaby Grimsby, who operated out of a cramped office in Chancery Lane. Grimsby reviewed the marriage settlement with a magnifying glass, his brow furrowing deeper with every passing second. "Well," Tristan demanded, pacing the floorboards, "can we appeal to the ecclesiastical courts? I am her husband. I demand the restitution of my conjugal rights. The law states she must submit to me, and thus submit her fortune." "The law, Your Grace, is a delicate instrument," Grimsby murmured, wiping sweat from his forehead. "And your wife's solicitor, Mr. Gresham, played it like a master violinist. By refusing to consummate the marriage, and by establishing a documented moral breach on the very night the contract was sealed, she triggered a specific punitive clause. Furthermore, She did not steal your wealth. She legally purchased your debts. If you attempt to sue her in the ecclesiastical courts for conjugal rights, she will simply countersue in the Court of Chancery for the immediate payment of the £200,000 you owe her trust. Since you cannot pay, she will have you thrown into Fleet Prison for debt. Tristan collapsed into a rickety chair, the breath knocked out of him. Fleet Prison? She would put a duke in debtor's prison? I believe, Your Grace, Grimsby said grimly, that a woman who evicts her husband at sunrise on her wedding day is capable of absolutely anything. Meanwhile, Arabella Montgomery, now the undisputed Duchess of Rothbury, was not resting on her laurels. She did not weep in her chambers, nor did she avoid the glaring eyes of society. She leaned into her new power with terrifying grace. She opened the Grosvenor Square mansion, throwing away Tristan's gaudy, outdated decor, and bringing in sleek, modern furnishings, paid for by her own vast fortune. She summoned the stewards of the Rothbury country estates and ruthlessly audited their books. She fired the corrupt bailiffs Tristan had hired, replaced them with efficient managers from her father's shipping company, and ordered the vast, uncultivated lands of the dukedom to be transformed into profitable sheep pastures and coal mining ventures. In a matter of months, Arabella was doing what Tristan's family had failed to do for a century. She was making the dukedom wildly profitable. Society matrons who had initially intended to shun her as a vulgar, aggressive tradesman's daughter suddenly found themselves desperate for her favor. Arabella held the mortgages of half the gentlemen in the House of Lords. When she attended Almac's assembly rooms, even the formidable Lady Cowper, a patroness who controlled the social registry of London, offered Arabella a curtsy. Power, Arabella quickly learned, was an excellent substitute for pedigree. But Tristan was not finished. Driven to the edge of madness by his squalid living conditions and his bruised ego, he devised a desperate, venomous plan. If the law would not help him, he would rely on the sheer, crushing weight of societal misogyny. He would publicly ruin her, frame her as a madwoman, and force the crown to intervene and appoint him as her legal guardian. He just needed the perfect stage. It was the height of the London season, and Arabella was hosting a grand ball at the Grosvenor Square mansion. It was a strategic display of absolute dominance. The house was illuminated by thousands of beeswax candles. The Duke of Sussex, a younger brother to the Prince Regent, was in attendance, sipping Arabella's imported champagne and laughing at her sharp wit. Arabella stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, a vision of untouchable authority. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, devoid of the fussy ruffles popular at the time, adorned only with a staggering sapphire necklace, a piece she had bought for herself. The orchestra was playing a lively quadrille when the heavy front doors burst open. The music faltered. Tristan Somerset stood in the threshold. He looked dreadful. His clothes, once the height of tailoring, hung loosely on his thinning frame. His face was unshaven, and his eyes burned with a feverish, desperate light. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The guests parted like the Red Sea as Tristan marched toward the staircase, his eyes locked on his wife. "Arabella," he shouted, his voice echoing over the hushed whispers of the aristocrats. "You have played your little game long enough. I am the Duke of Rothbury, and I am the master of this house." Arabella did not flinch. She looked down at him with the calm detachment of a scientist observing an insect. "You are intruding, Tristan," she said, her voice perfectly modulated to carry across the silent room. "This is a private residence, and you do not have an invitation." "I do not need an invitation to my own home," Tristan snarled, taking a step up the stairs. "I am your husband. By the laws of God in England, you are my property. And I am formally declaring to this assembly that my wife is of unsound mind. She is a hysterical, unnatural woman who has unlawfully seized my assets. I demand the magistrates step in and restore my rightful place," the crowd murmured. It was a dangerous accusation. In 1814, a husband could indeed have his wife committed to a madhouse if he could convince a physician and a magistrate that she was rebellious and insane. It was the ultimate weapon of patriarchy. Arabella slowly descended the stairs, her movements fluid and utterly fearless. She stopped one step above him. "You wish to involve the magistrates, Tristan?" she asked softly, though the entire room strained to hear every word. "I will see you locked in Bedlam if you do not yield to me tonight," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. Arabella sighed. It was not a sigh of defeat, but of profound disappointment. "Martha," she called out clearly. From the shadows near the drawing room door, her loyal maid stepped forward, holding a silver tray. On the tray sat a single, red-ribboned dossier. Martha brought it to Arabella, who took it delicately in her gloved hands. "I had hoped to spare you the final shred of your dignity, Tristan," Arabella said, turning to address the crowd, projecting her voice. "But since you insist on making this a public matter of the law, I suppose I must oblige." She looked back down at her husband. "When I purchased your debts, Tristan, I did not just acquire your gambling markers and your mortgages. I also acquired your private ledgers. I conducted a thorough audit of your finances over the last 5 years." Tristan's confident sneer faltered slightly. "You found nothing but standard aristocratic debts. You cannot shame me for spending money." "Oh, I am not shaming you for spending money," Arabella corrected smoothly. "I am shaming you for times you acquired it. 2 years ago, during the Peninsular War, you were named an honorary treasurer for the Lord Wellington Veteran Relief Fund, a charity established to support the widows and crippled soldiers returning from Spain." Tristan froze. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might faint. "You owed a massive debt to a French syndicate," Arabella continued, her voice echoing like a death knell in the silent ballroom. "A syndicate tied directly to Napoleon's financiers. You were desperate. So, you forged the signatures of the charity's trustees. You embezzled £12,000 from the widows and orphans of English soldiers, and you sent that money across the channel to the enemy." The silence in the room was absolute. Then, a low, horrified murmur began to build. The Duke of Sussex, standing near the punch bowl, looked at Tristan with an expression of pure, murderous disgust. "That is a lie!" Tristan shrieked, panic clawing at his throat. "She lies! She is mad!" "I hold the original ledgers, the forged bank drafts, and the intercepted correspondence with the Parisian bankers," Arabella stated calmly, tapping the red-ribboned dossier. "My solicitor has already authenticated the signatures. You did not just bankrupt your family, Tristan. You committed high treason. And you stole from the heroes of England to do it." Tristan stumbled backward, gripping the banister for support. He knew it was true. He knew she had the documents. He had left them hidden in a secret compartment in his desk, the very desk Arabella had claimed on their wedding night. "Treason carries the penalty of the gallows, Tristan," Arabella whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "Or, at the very least, a lifetime in the Tower of London, stripped of your title, your lands forfeited to the crown. You would die a disgraced traitor." Tristan was trembling violently. He looked around the room. There was no sympathy in the eyes of his peers. There was only revulsion. He was a pariah. What do you want?" he choked out, tears of absolute terror spilling down his cheeks. Arabella straightened her spine. "These are my terms," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "First, you will sign a formal deed of separation tonight. You will formally relinquish any and all claims to my person, my wealth, and my trust. Second, you will surrender all proxy voting rights in the House of Lords to an agent of my choosing. Third, you will leave England by sunrise. I will provide you with an annual stipend of £500, enough to live quietly in a modest cottage in Naples. If you ever set foot on British soil again, if you ever write my name, or if you ever attempt to contact me, I will immediately surrender this dossier to the Crown prosecutors." Tristan stared at her. £500 a year. It was a pittance. It was the salary of a moderately successful merchant. He would live in exile, entirely forgotten, while a merchant's daughter ruled his ancestral domain. But the alternative was the hangman's noose. He looked at the unyielding porcelain mask of his wife's face. He finally understood what Penelope had realized on that first morning. He had not married a woman. He had married a force of nature, and he had foolishly tried to stand in her way. I will sign, Tristan whispered, breaking into violent sobs. Mr. Gresham is waiting for you in the library, Arabella said coldly. He has the papers prepared. Do not linger, Tristan. You have a ship to catch. Arabella watched without a shred of pity as the broken, weeping man, who was technically her husband, turned and dragged himself toward the library, escorted by 2 of her footmen. The ballroom remained perfectly silent for a long moment. The aristocracy of London stared at the Duchess of Rothbury, a mixture of awe and absolute terror in their eyes. Arabella turned slowly, the sapphire necklace gleaming at her throat. She looked toward the orchestra pit. Well, she said, a small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The night is young, and we were promised a waltz. Let the music continue. The conductor scrambled to raise his baton, and the sweeping notes of a Strauss waltz immediately filled the room. The guests, eager to distance themselves from the disgraced Duke and desperate to curry favor with the most powerful woman in England, rushed the dance floor. Arabella Montgomery, the Duchess of Rothbury, stood at the top of the stairs, gazing out over her empire. She had been promised a title in exchange for her fortune, and she had received it. But she had taken something far more valuable. She had taken her freedom, and she would never, ever let it go. Arabella's ruthless triumph proves that a broken heart is nothing compared to a brilliantly executed revenge. From a humiliated bride to the untouchable ruler of a dukedom, she flipped the script and made Tristan pay for every ounce of his arrogance. If you loved watching this powerful duchess outsmart the aristocracy and seize her own destiny, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story of ultimate payback. And subscribe to the channel for more dramatic historical tales of scandal and victory.